The raging waters of the Arkansas River rose with malevolent intent, swallowing the lowlands of Willow Creek as Penelope Foster stood frozen on the porch of her family's homestead, watching the wagon carrying her parents and younger siblings disappear into the distance. The floodwaters had come faster than anyone predicted, and in the chaos of their hasty departure, no one had noticed she wasn't aboard. It was May of 1873, and at 18 years old, Penelope had never witnessed such devastation. The spring rains had been relentless for weeks, and now the river had broken free of its banks with catastrophic fury. Water already lapped at the foundation of their modest home, the current growing stronger with each passing minute. "Ma, Pa." She screamed, her voice drowned by the roar of the flood and the distant rumble of thunder. The wagon was merely a speck on the horizon now, headed for the safety of higher ground at Redemption Ridge. Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs as she assessed her situation. The horses were gone, taken with the wagon. The water was rising rapidly, already seeping between the floorboards of the porch. She retreated inside, grabbing what few possessions she could, a photograph of her family, her mother's silver locket, and a small leather-bound Bible, and stuffed them into a canvas bag. She climbed to the second floor of the house, hoping someone would realize she was missing and return for her. Through the window, she watched as the water continued its relentless climb, carrying debris from upstream branches, fence posts, and pieces of other less fortunate homesteads. Night was falling, and with it came a bone-deep chill. The rain continued to drum against the roof, and Penelope wrapped herself in a quilt, fighting back tears. She was not one to surrender to despair, but the gravity of her situation weighed heavily upon her. If the water rose much higher, the house itself might not withstand the current. As darkness enveloped the valley, Penelope lit a single lantern, placing it in the window as a beacon. She prayed someone would see it before the waters claimed her completely. Miles away, Griffin Hayes led his horse through the muddy streets of Willow Creek. At 25, he had already lived several lifetimes' worth of adventure as a cowhand, scout, and occasionally, a bounty hunter. He'd been returning to his small cabin outside town when he'd encountered the exodus of families fleeing the flood. "The Foster place is likely underwater by now," he overheard someone say as families huddled under makeshift shelters on the Ridge Road. "Such a shame. Fine folk, the Fosters," another voice replied. "At least they got out in time, saw them headed up to Redemption Ridge with the others." Griffin might have continued on his way, but something made him pause. He'd met Jacob Foster once or twice, a hard-working man with a kind face. Griffin recalled him mentioning his family, including a daughter about to become a schoolteacher. "Mr. Foster," Griffin approached a haggard-looking man clutching a small girl to his chest. "Your family all accounted for?" Jacob Foster's face went ashen. "Mary," he called to his wife, who was tending to their young son. "Where's Penelope?" The realization hit them like a physical blow. In the chaos of their hasty departure, their eldest daughter had been left behind. "She was gathering her books," Mary Foster whispered, horror dawning on her face. I thought she was in the wagon with us." "I'll go back for her," Griffin said without hesitation, already turning toward his horse. "You can't." Jacob grabbed his arm. "The water's too high now, the road's gone, you'll drown yourself trying." Griffin looked the man squarely in the eyes. "I know these lands better than most. There's a path through the western ridge that might still be passable. If your daughter's at the house, there's still time." Before anyone could protest further, Griffin mounted his stallion, Thunder, and set off into the stormy night. The rain pelted his face as he urged his horse forward, away from the safety of higher ground and back toward the flood-ravaged valley. The journey was treacherous. Twice, Thunder nearly lost his footing on the slick, narrow path that wound along the ridge. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the devastation below. What had once been peaceful farmland was now a churning lake, punctuated by the rooftops of submerged buildings. Griffin's heart sank. If the Foster girl was still down there, her chances were slim. Yet something drove him forward, perhaps the memory of his own sister, lost to a fever years ago when he'd been away working cattle drives. He hadn't been there when she needed him most, a regret that still haunted his dreams. Through the curtain of rain, Griffin spotted a faint glow in the distance, a single light shining from the upper floor of a house partially submerged in the floodwaters. The Foster place. Penelope startled at the sound of splashing below. The water had risen to the first-floor ceiling and the house groaned under the pressure. She peered out the window, her lantern casting weak light into the darkness. A figure on horseback was approaching, navigating the treacherous waters with determined precision. Hope surged within her chest. "Hello," she called out, throwing open the window despite the rain. "I'm here, up here." The rider looked up, and in a flash of lightning, Penelope caught a glimpse of his face, strong-jawed and intensely focused. She had seen him in town before, a cowboy who kept to himself but was known for his fairness and skill with horses. "Miss Foster?" His deep voice carried over the roar of the water. "Your family sent me. The house isn't safe. We need to get you out." "How?" She called back, fear mingling with relief. The water surrounding the house was at least 6 feet deep and flowing rapidly. "I'm coming to you," he answered, guiding his horse closer to the house. "Be ready to climb down. Bring only what you absolutely need." Penelope gathered her small bag of treasures and took one last look around the room that had been her sanctuary since childhood. Then she leaned out the window, watching as the cowboy maneuvered his horse directly beneath her. "You'll have to jump," he called up, standing precariously in his stirrups and reaching toward her. "I'll catch you." The distance seemed impossible, but the alternative was unthinkable. Taking a deep breath, Penelope climbed onto the windowsill, clutching her bag to her chest. "Trust me," the cowboy said, his eyes locked on hers. In that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken promise. Penelope closed her eyes and leapt. Strong arms caught her around the waist, and she found herself pressed against the solid chest of her rescuer. The horse beneath them neighed nervously as the current buffeted its legs. "Hold tight," the cowboy instructed, settling her in front of him on the saddle. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and despite the danger, Penelope felt strangely safe. "I'm Griffin Hayes," he said against her ear as he turned the horse away from the disintegrating house. "And we're going to get through this, Miss Foster, I promise you that." As they began their perilous journey through the flood, Penelope looked back once at her childhood home. With a sickening crack, the structure began to collapse, surrendering to the merciless water. Had Griffin arrived even minutes later, she would have been lost. "Thank you," she whispered, though she doubted he could hear her over the storm. The path Griffin chose took them along what had once been the main road, but was now a raging river. Thunder fought valiantly against the current, his powerful muscles straining. Griffin kept one arm firmly around Penelope's waist, his body a shield against the wind and rain. "There's a rise ahead," he told her after they had traveled for what seemed like hours. "Once we reach it, we'll be above the flood line." Penelope nodded, too exhausted and cold to speak. She had long since lost feeling in her fingers and toes, and her soaked dress clung to her skin like a shroud. The horse struggled up the incline, his hooves slipping in the mud. Griffin dismounted, leading Thunder by the reins while supporting Penelope in the saddle. "Almost there," he encouraged, his voice a lifeline in the darkness. When they finally crested the rise, they found themselves on a small plateau overlooking the flooded valley. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, and through breaks in the clouds, stars were beginning to appear. "We can't make it to Redemption Ridge tonight," Griffin said, scanning the horizon. "There's an old line shack about a mile from here. It's not much, but it's dry and has a fireplace." Penelope nodded gratefully. The thought of warmth and shelter was almost too wonderful to contemplate. The line shack was indeed modest, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot, a rickety table, and 2 chairs. But to Penelope, it looked like a palace. Griffin helped her dismount, catching her when her numb legs buckled beneath her. He carried her inside and set her gently on one of the chairs. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, turning to tend to his horse. "I'll unsaddle Thunder and gather some firewood. There should be some old clothes in the trunk by the cot. They won't fit well, but they'll be dry." Before Penelope could respond, he was gone, closing the door behind him to give her privacy. She fumbled with the buttons of her dress, her fingers clumsy with cold. The trunk yielded a man's flannel shirt and a pair of wool trousers far too large for her slender frame. But Griffin had been right, they were blessedly dry. By the time he returned with an armload of firewood, Penelope had changed and wrapped herself in a threadbare blanket from the cot. Her long auburn hair hung in damp waves down her back, and her face was pale with exhaustion. Griffin said nothing as he built a fire, his movements efficient and practiced. Soon, flames leaped in the fireplace, casting a golden glow throughout the small space. "You should take the cot," Griffin said, finally breaking the silence. "I'll make do on the floor." "Mr. Hayes," Penelope began, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You risked your life for a stranger." Griffin's expression softened slightly. "No thanks necessary, Miss Foster. Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she pointed out. "You did." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Well, let's just say I understand what it's like to be left behind." There was a story there, Penelope sensed, but exhaustion was claiming her rapidly. She moved to the cot and lay down, pulling the blanket tightly around herself. "Your family will be worried sick," Griffin said, settling himself on the floor near the fire. "As soon as dawn breaks, we'll head for Redemption Ridge. Should take most of the day, but we'll get there." "Will the waters recede by then?" Penelope asked sleepily. "Not entirely, but I know a route that should keep us above the worst of it." Penelope wanted to ask more questions, to learn about this quiet man who had appeared like an angel in the storm, but her eyelids grew too heavy to keep open. The last thing she remembered was the comforting crackle of the fire and the silhouette of Griffin Hayes keeping watch in the darkness. She awoke to the aroma of coffee. Sunlight streamed through the single window of the lined shack, and Griffin stood at the small stove, stirring something in a pot. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Found some beans and coffee in the supplies. Not much of a breakfast, but it's hot." Penelope sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. In the light of day, she could see her rescuer clearly for the first time. Griffin Hayes was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin. His hair was dark as midnight, and his eyes were a striking shade of green that reminded her of the pine forests in summer. A scar ran along his jawline, telling of past hardships, but it did nothing to diminish his handsome features. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. "For everything." Griffin nodded, a man of few words. As they ate their simple meal, Penelope learned that he had worked as a cowhand on various ranches throughout the territory before settling near Willow Creek 2 years earlier. "I do odd jobs mostly," he explained. "Breaking horses, tracking strays, guiding travelers through the passes, and rescuing damsels in distress," Penelope added with a small smile. A hint of color touched Griffin's cheeks. "That's a new addition to my services." Their eyes met briefly, and something flickered between them, a connection neither could quite name. The journey to Redemption Ridge began under clear skies, a stark contrast to the previous night's tempest. Griffin had found a spare set of boots in the shack that, while too large for Penelope, were serviceable when stuffed with rags. She rode behind him on Thunder, her arms loosely circling his waist for balance. The landscape bore the scars of the flood-uprooted trees, displaced boulders, and thick mud that sucked at Thunder's hooves. The valley below remained largely submerged, a vast lake where farms and pastures had once been. "Will people be able to return?" Penelope asked, gazing at the devastation. "Some will," Griffin replied. "Others will move on. That's the way of things out here. Nature reminds us who's really in charge." They stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat the jerky Griffin had in his saddlebags. Sitting on a fallen log, Penelope watched as he tended to Thunder, his movements gentle despite his weathered appearance. "Have you always been on your own, Mr. Hayes?" she asked. Griffin was quiet for so long that Penelope thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "Had a family once. Parents, a sister, lost Pa to a mining accident when I was 12. Ma and my sister Abigail kept the farm going while I worked cattle drives to bring in money, then a fever swept through while I was away." He paused, his hands stilling on Thunder's flank. "By the time I got the news and made it back, I was burying them both." "I'm so sorry," Penelope said, her heart aching for the pain he'd carried. Griffin shrugged, but the casualness of the gesture couldn't mask the old wound. "It was a long time ago, nearly 8 years now." "Is that why you came back for me? Because of your sister?" His green eyes met hers, surprisingly vulnerable. "Maybe, or maybe it's just what decent folks do for each other out here." They continued their journey, the terrain growing steeper as they approached Redemption Ridge. Penelope learned that Griffin had fought briefly in the war before deserting, not out of cowardice, he explained, but because he couldn't reconcile killing men from the north when his own cousins lived in Pennsylvania. "Some call me a coward for it," he said without bitterness. "But I answer to my own conscience, not theirs. I think it takes more courage to follow your heart than to follow orders you believe are wrong," Penelope replied. Griffin glanced back at her, something like appreciation in his gaze. "Your pa mentioned you're to be a schoolteacher." "That was the plan," she said. "I was supposed to start at the schoolhouse in Willow Creek next month, but now—" Her voice trailed off as she considered the town that lay underwater. "Towns rebuild," Griffin assured her, "or new ones spring up. Teachers will always be needed." The sun was beginning its descent when they finally caught sight of the encampment at Redemption Ridge. Dozens of families had taken refuge on the plateau, erecting makeshift tents and lean toss. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children played between the temporary shelters. A cry went up as they were spotted, and suddenly people were running toward them. At the forefront were Jacob and Mary Foster, their faces transformed by joy and disbelief. "Penelope," her mother sobbed, reaching up as Griffin helped her dismount. "Oh, my girl, my precious girl." Her father embraced them both, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. "We thought we'd lost you forever." "Mr. Hayes found me," Penelope explained, turning to her rescuer who had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance away. "He came back when no one else could." Jacob Foster approached Griffin, grasping his hand firmly. "How can we ever repay you? You've returned our daughter to us." Griffin shook his head. "No payment necessary, sir. I'm just glad I reached her in time." The Fosters insisted that Griffin join them for supper, humble though it was beans, cornbread, and coffee shared around a small fire. Penelope's younger siblings peppered him with questions about the rescue, which he answered patiently if sparingly. As night fell, families retreated to their shelters. Griffin prepared to leave, checking Thunder's saddle. "You're not staying?" Penelope asked, approaching him at the edge of the camp. "Better head back while there's still some moonlight," he replied. "Got work waiting." Will we see you again?" The question escaped before she could consider its propriety. Griffin's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "Willow Creek's a small place, Miss Foster. I expect our paths will cross." It wasn't much of a promise, but Penelope felt a strange disappointment as she watched him ride away, his figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. The next weeks were a blur of activity as the flood survivors established a more permanent settlement on Redemption Ridge. Some, like the Fosters, determined to return to their land once the waters receded. Others decided to move on, seeking new beginnings elsewhere. Penelope threw herself into helping organize the community, assisting with cooking, caring for children while parents salvaged what they could from the valley below, and even starting impromptu lessons for the school-aged children to maintain some sense of normalcy. All the while, she found herself watching the trail, hoping for a glimpse of a tall cowboy on a dark horse. But Griffin Hayes did not return to Redemption Ridge. After a month, the floodwaters had receded enough that families could begin the process of rebuilding. The Foster homestead, like many others, had been destroyed, but the land remained. Jacob Foster was determined to start anew. "We'll build it stronger this time," he told his family as they surveyed the mud-covered ruins of their home, higher up the slope away from the river's reach. While her parents and siblings camped in a tent on their property, Penelope accepted a position as a temporary boarder and assistant to Mrs. Abernathy. the widow who ran the general store in the small settlement that had sprung up on Redemption Ridge. The arrangement allowed her to earn a small wage while plans for rebuilding the school in Willow Creek were discussed. It was during her second week working at the store that the bell above the door jingled, and Griffin Hayes walked in. Penelope nearly dropped the bolt of calico she was measuring for a customer. "Mr. Hayes," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "What a surprise." He nodded politely, removing his hat. "Miss Foster, good to see you looking well." After she finished with her customer, Penelope approached Griffin, who was examining a display of tools. Up close, she could see that he looked tired, with a new cut healing above his right eyebrow. "We've wondered how you were faring," she said. "My parents would love to see you if you have time to visit their camp." "That's kind of them," Griffin replied. "Actually, I've been helping clear debris from the valley. Your father hired me to salvage what I could from your homestead." Penelope's eyes widened. "He didn't mention it to me. Asked me just yesterday. Found a few things that might be of value to your family." He gestured to his saddlebags. "Thought I'd deliver them to you personally." From the bag, Griffin carefully withdrew several items. Her mother's silver cutlery set, miraculously intact, a daguerreotype of her grandparents, and most precious of all, her mother's music box, its painted surface mudded but undamaged. "The music still plays," Griffin said softly as Penelope took the box with trembling hands. "Tested it myself." She opened the lid and the delicate notes of Beautiful Dreamer filled the quiet store. Tears welled in her eyes. "This was my grandmother's," she whispered. "My mother thought it was lost forever." Griffin shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her gratitude. "Just doing the job I was paid for." "No," Penelope shook her head. "You went beyond that. You always do." Something flickered in his green eyes, a vulnerability quickly masked. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Foster, I should be getting back. More work to be done before sundown." Before she could respond, he had replaced his hat and was heading for the door. Impulsively, Penelope called after him. "Mr. Hayes, there's to be a gathering on Saturday. A social to raise spirits and funds for rebuilding. Perhaps you might attend." Griffin paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, Penelope thought he would refuse. "I'm not much for socials, Miss Foster," he said slowly, "but I'll consider it." With that, he was gone, leaving Penelope staring after him, the music box still playing its sweet melody in her hands. Saturday arrived bright and clear. The community had transformed the central clearing of the settlement into a festive space, with tables for food, an area cleared for dancing, and lanterns strung between trees for when evening fell. Penelope wore her best dress, a blue cotton that had fortunately been packed in the wagon during their escape, with her hair arranged in a simple but elegant style. She told herself her careful preparations had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing Griffin Hayes, but her eyes continued to scan the growing crowd for his tall figure. The social was in full swing, children playing games, adults chatting and enjoying the first real celebration since the flood when Penelope spotted him standing at the edge of the gathering. He looked different, almost unrecognizable at first. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and he wore a crisp white shirt under a black vest instead of his usual work clothes. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Penelope felt her heart quicken. She made her way toward him, weaving between groups of chatting neighbors. "You came," she said simply when she reached him. Griffin shifted his weight, looking slightly uncomfortable in his fine clothes. "Thought it might be good to see something besides mud and debris for a change." "Well, I'm glad," Penelope smiled. "Have you eaten Mrs. Abernathy made her famous apple pie?" Griffin allowed her to lead him to the food tables, where he filled a plate with fried chicken, beans, and cornbread. They sat at the edge of the gathering, watching as several men tuned fiddles and a banjo for dancing. "How goes the rebuilding?" Penelope asked after they had eaten in companionable silence. "Progress is slow but steady," Griffin replied. "Your father's chosen a good spot for the new house. Higher ground, better drainage. It should be ready before winter sets in." "And what about you? Will you stay in the area?" Griffin took a sip from his cup before answering. "For now, there's plenty of work for a man willing to do it." The music started up a lively reel that had couples forming sets for dancing. Penelope watched, tapping her foot to the rhythm. "Would you care to dance, Miss Foster?" The question surprised her so completely that she stared at Griffin for a moment before finding her voice. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Hayes." He offered his hand, and when she took it, Penelope felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Griffin led her to the dance area, taking position across from her as the set formed. To her surprise, Griffin was a capable dancer, moving with the same fluid grace he showed on horseback. As they circled each other, hands meeting briefly before parting, Penelope caught glimpses of a different man beneath the stoic exterior, one who smiled more freely, whose green eyes held a light she hadn't seen before. They danced 3 sets before taking a break, both flushed and slightly breathless. Griffin fetched cups of lemonade, and they walked a little apart from the crowd to catch their breath. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Hayes," Penelope said, taking a sip of the cool drink. "I wouldn't have taken you for a dancing man." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "My mother insisted her children learn, said it was a civilized skill that would serve us well." "She was right," Penelope replied. "Though I suspect there are many things about you that would surprise me." Griffin's expression grew thoughtful. "Not so many, I'm afraid. What you see is largely what you get, Miss Foster." "I'm not so sure about that," she said softly. "The man who rode through a flood to save a stranger, who searches through mud to find a family's treasures, who dances as though he actually enjoys it. That man is worth knowing better, I think." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the noise of the social faded away. Griffin took a step closer, close enough that Penelope could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "Penelope," he said, using her given name for the first time. Penny." The moment was broken by the arrival of Penelope's younger sister, Sarah. "Ma's looking for you. Says it's time to serve the desserts." Reluctantly, Penelope nodded. "Tell her I'll be right there." She turned back to Griffin. "Will you wait? There's something I'd like to ask you." He nodded, and Penelope hurried to help with the dessert table. But when she returned to their spot at the edge of the clearing 20 minutes later, Griffin Hayes was nowhere to be found. August turned to September, and still the rebuilding continued. The new foster home took shape on the hillside, a sturdier structure than the one that had been lost. Penelope divided her time between helping at the general store, assisting her family, and teaching the children of Redemption Ridge in a makeshift school under a large canvas tent. She saw Griffin occasionally during this time, usually from a distance as he delivered lumber or helped raise a roof beam. He would tip his hat politely if their eyes met, but made no effort to engage in conversation. The connection they had shared at the social seemed to have vanished like morning mist under the summer sun. It was during the first week of October, as a chill crept into the evening air, that Penelope found herself alone at the partially completed foster home. Her parents had taken the younger children to the general store for supplies, and Penelope had stayed behind to clean and organize the kitchen area, which was nearly finished. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up from her work. Through the open doorway, she saw Griffin dismounting from Thunder. He carried a wooden crate which he set down carefully on the porch before noticing Penelope watching him. "Miss Foster," he said, removing his hat, "I didn't expect to find anyone here." "My family's gone to the store," she explained, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached the door. "What brings you by, Mr. Hayes?" Griffin gestured to the crate. "Window glass. Your father ordered it special from Denver. Thought I'd deliver it while the weather's fair." "That's very kind of you," Penelope said. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Griffin cleared his throat. "Well, I should be on my way. Please tell your father the glass arrived safely." As he turned to leave, Penelope found her voice. "Why did you leave the social without saying goodbye?" Griffin stopped, his back to her. For a long moment he didn't move or speak. "It seemed best," he finally said, still not turning to face her. "Best for whom?" Penelope pressed, emboldened by the knowledge that they were alone. Now Griffin did turn, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Foster, I'm not the kind of man who belongs at socials, dancing with respectable young ladies." "And what kind of man are you then?" she asked, stepping onto the porch. Griffin's jaw tightened. "The kind with nothing to offer but hard work and harder memories. The kind who's better off alone." "I don't believe that," Penelope said softly, "and I don't think you do either, not really." Something flickered in his eyes, a longing quickly suppressed. "What I believe doesn't change the facts. You're educated from a good family. You'll be a school teacher, respected in the community. I'm a drifter who stayed in one place longer than usual, that's all." "Is that why you saved me from the flood? Because you're just a drifter?" Penelope challenged, taking another step toward him. "Is that why you searched through mud for my mother's music box? Why you came to the social looking so handsome it made my heart stop?" Griffin's carefully constructed facade cracked slightly. "Penelope, I'm not asking for promises," she interrupted. "I'm just asking you to stop running away from whatever this is between us." They stood facing each other on the porch, the autumn breeze stirring the golden leaves of the cottonwood trees that lined the property. Griffin's struggle was evident in the tension of his shoulders, the clenching of his jaw. "I should go," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. But as he turned away once more, Penelope did something entirely improper for a young lady of her upbringing. She reached out and caught his arm, turning him back to face her. "Griffin Hayes," she said firmly, "you rode through a flood to save my life. The least you can do is be honest with me now." Something broke in his expression, a dam giving way to long, restrained feelings. "You want honesty? Fine. I think about you every day. I see your face when I close my eyes at night. I hear your laugh when the wind blows through the trees. And it terrifies me because everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me, and I don't know if I could survive losing someone again." His words hung in the air between them, raw and true. Penelope's heart raced as she absorbed their meaning. "I can't promise you won't lose me someday," she said quietly. "No one can promise that, but I can promise that right now in this moment I'm here, and I feel the same way about you." Griffin's resistance crumbled visibly. With gentle hesitation, he raised a calloused hand to her cheek, his touch feather-light. "Penelope Foster," he whispered, "you deserve better than a man like me." "I deserve a man who sees me for who I am," she replied, leaning slightly into his touch. "Who respects me enough to be honest about his feelings, who's brave enough to take a chance on happiness, even knowing it might not last forever." The space between them seemed to shrink of its own accord. Griffin's eyes searched hers, seeking permission for what they both wanted. Penelope gave the slightest nod, and then his lips were on hers, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as she responded in kind. It was Penelope's first kiss, and it was everything the dime novels had promised, and more, a warmth that spread from her lips to her toes, a dizzying sense of rightness, a feeling of coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, Griffin kept his forehead pressed to hers, his breathing unsteady. "I don't know where this leads," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out if you're willing." Penelope smiled, her heart fuller than she'd ever known it could be. "I'm willing." The sound of a wagon approaching broke the moment. Griffin stepped back respectfully as the Foster family returned home, though the look he shared with Penelope held the promise of more moments to come. That evening, Griffin Hayes joined the Foster family for supper at their invitation. Sitting across from Penelope at the makeshift table, he caught her eye occasionally, a private smile passing between them. After the meal, he formally asked Jacob Foster's permission to court his daughter, a request that was granted with a knowing smile and a firm handshake. As the days shortened and the nights grew colder, Griffin became a regular visitor at the Foster home. He assisted with the final stages of construction, sharing meals with the family, and when work was done, spending time with Penelope on the porch, talking late into the evening. They learned each other's stories, Griffin's difficult years after losing his family, his dreams of someday having a ranch of his own, Penelope's love of teaching, her passion for books, her hope of making a difference in the lives of frontier children. They discovered shared values: honesty, hard work, loyalty, and complementary differences that made their conversations endlessly engaging. By November, the new Foster home was complete, a sturdy two-story structure built to withstand whatever nature might bring. The community gathered for a house-raising celebration, with music, food, and dancing in the newly finished barn. As they danced together, Penelope couldn't help noticing how different Griffin looked from the solemn cowboy who had rescued her months before. He smiled more easily now, laughed more frequently, and the haunted look that had once shadowed his eyes had largely disappeared. "What are you thinking?" he asked as they swayed to a slow waltz, his hand warm against her back. "That I hardly recognize you sometimes," she replied honestly. "You seem lighter." Griffin's smile was soft, meant only for her. "I feel lighter. You've given me something I thought I'd lost for good, Penelope." "And what's that, Hope?" he said simply. "A reason to build something lasting instead of just passing through." The words warmed her more than any fire could have. As winter settled over the valley, their courtship deepened. Griffin had taken a position as foreman at the Henderson Ranch nearby, a steady job that allowed him to put aside savings while remaining close to Redemption Ridge. Christmas brought another social gathering, this time in the newly rebuilt church. Pine boughs and red ribbons decorated the simple space, and candles glowed in the windows. After the service, as families exchanged modest gifts and shared treats, Griffin drew Penelope outside into the still, cold night. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the star-filled sky, catching in Penelope's hair like tiny diamonds. Griffin took both her hands in his expression serious despite the joy of the season. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small package wrapped in brown paper. Penelope unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver locket, similar to the one she had saved from the flood but newer, its surface engraved with intricate flowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, opening it to find it empty inside. "Thank you, Griffin," I thought. He hesitated, uncharacteristically nervous. "I thought someday it might hold a picture of us, of our family, if you'll have me." Penelope's heart skipped a beat as she realized what he was saying. "Griffin," he took a deep breath, then knelt in the fresh snow before her, still holding her hands. "Penelope Foster, I came back for you once through a flood, and I promise to keep coming back for you every day for the rest of my life if you'll be my wife." Joy bubbled up within her like a spring. "Yes," she said without hesitation, tears of happiness warming her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Griffin Hayes." He rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that belied his strength. Above them, the stars witnessed their promise, and the snow continued to fall, covering the scars of the flood with a pristine blanket of white nature's way of offering a fresh start. They were married in April of 1874, when the wildflowers carpeted the hillsides and the new leaves were the bright green of beginnings. The ceremony took place in the rebuilt church, with the entire community in attendance. Penelope wore a dress of ivory satin that her mother and sisters had worked on secretly through the winter. And Griffin looked impossibly handsome in a new suit, his green eyes never leaving his bride as they spoke their vows. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and more food than the small settlement had seen since before the flood. As the party continued, the newlyweds slipped away, riding double on thunder to the small cabin Griffin had built on a piece of land he'd purchased at the base of Redemption Ridge. It was modest but solid, with a stone fireplace, 2 rooms, and a covered porch that offered a view of the valley. Griffin had furnished it simply but thoughtfully: a bed with a handmade quilt, a rocking chair by the fire, shelves for Penelope's books, and a small table where they would share meals. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," Griffin said softly as he carried her across the threshold. Later, as they lay together in the quiet of their first night as husband and wife, the intimacy they shared was both passionate and tender, a physical expression of the deep bond that had formed between them since that stormy night when Griffin had appeared like a guardian angel in the flood. "I never thought I'd find this," Griffin whispered, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on Penelope's bare shoulder. "A home, someone to share it with." Penelope raised herself on one elbow, looking down at her husband's face in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. When the flood came, I thought I'd lost everything, but it brought me to you, or you to me." Griffin smiled, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Either way, I'm thankful for it. Even though you had to ride through a raging river to rescue a stubborn girl who got left behind." She teased, "Especially for that," he replied, pulling her close. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Spring turned to summer, and their life together fell into pleasant rhythms. Griffin continued working as foreman at the Henderson Ranch, while Penelope taught at the newly rebuilt schoolhouse in the revitalized town of Willow Creek. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, talking about their days and their dreams for the future. Those dreams began to take more concrete shape as Griffin's hard work and careful saving allowed them to purchase additional acreage adjoining their property. By their first anniversary, they had begun to establish a small ranch of their own, with a few head of cattle, 2 milk cows, chickens, and a vegetable garden that Penelope tended with loving care. "I was thinking," Griffin said one evening as they sat on the porch after a long day of work, his arm around Penelope's shoulders. "What if we built onto the cabin, add a couple more rooms?" Penelope smiled, taking his free hand and placing it on her abdomen, which had just begun to show the slightest curve. "I was thinking the same thing. We might need the space soon." Griffin's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. "Are you saying—" "Yes," Penelope nodded, her eyes shining. "Come November, there will be 3 of us." The joy that transformed Griffin's face was something Penelope knew she would remember until her dying day. He gathered her in his arms, his touch gentle as though she had suddenly become fragile treasure. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." The months that followed were filled with preparations, the addition of 2 rooms to the cabin, the crafting of a cradle that Griffin worked on during the evenings, the sewing of tiny garments that Penelope did by lamplight after her teaching duties were complete. On a cold, clear night in late November, with snow blanketing the world outside, Penelope gave birth to a daughter. Griffin paced anxiously in the main room while the midwife attended his wife, and when the cry of a newborn finally pierced the night, he felt his heart might burst with love. "Come meet your daughter," the midwife called, and Griffin entered the bedroom on unsteady legs. Penelope looked exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She smiled up at her husband, tears of joy tracking down her cheeks. "She has your eyes," Penelope whispered as Griffin sat carefully on the edge of the bed. And indeed, when the infant opened her eyes briefly, they were the same striking green as her father's. Griffin reached out a trembling finger which the baby grasped reflexively, her tiny hand a miracle of perfection. "What shall we call her?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Penelope had been considering names for months, but in that moment only one seemed right. "Abigail," she said softly. "After your sister, Abigail Hope Hayes." Griffin's eyes filled with tears. "Abigail Hope," he repeated, the name a blessing on his lips. "It's perfect. She's perfect." As winter settled over the land, the Hayes family found a new rhythm to their days and nights. Griffin took on more of the household duties, allowing Penelope to rest and care for their daughter. He would often sit in the rocking chair by the fire, holding little Abigail against his chest, singing softly the lullabies his own mother had once sung to him. Penelope would watch them together, her heart so full of love it seemed impossible to contain it all. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she would remember the flood that had changed the course of her life, the terror of being left behind, the miraculous appearance of Griffin on horseback, the journey to higher ground that had ultimately led her here, to this life richer than any she could have imagined. Spring brought new growth to the land and new developments for the family. Griffin's careful management of their small herd had paid off, and they were able to hire 2 hands to help with the expanding ranch. Penelope resumed teaching, though on a reduced schedule that allowed her to bring Abigail with her to the schoolhouse several days a week. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges. A drought in the summer of '76 tested their resilience. but Griffin's foresight in building water storage systems saved their cattle when others in the region lost their herds. A second child, a son they named James Jacob after both their fathers, arrived in the winter of '77, completing their family in a way that felt ordained. By the time Abigail was 5 and James 2, the Hayes Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the county. The original cabin had been expanded into a comfortable home with a stone foundation, glass windows, and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Griffin, once a solitary drifter, had become a respected rancher known for his fair dealings and quiet generosity to those in need. Penelope continued to teach, having established a reputation as an educator who could inspire even the most reluctant learners. When the town council proposed building a larger school to accommodate the growing population, they unanimously voted to name it the Foster Hayes Academy in honor of her contributions to the community. On the 10th anniversary of the flood that had brought them together, Griffin and Penelope rode out alone to the spot where their story had begun. The old Foster homestead was long gone, with no trace remaining of the house that had nearly become Penelope's tomb. The river flowed peacefully within its banks, giving no hint of its destructive potential. They dismounted, spreading a blanket on the grassy bank for a simple picnic. The day was warm, the sky a clear blue that reflected in the water below. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years, Penelope said, gazing at the tranquil scene. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Griffin nodded, his hand finding hers on the blanket. "I still remember exactly how you looked when I found you in that window, terrified but determined." "I knew then you were someone special," Penelope smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "And I remember thinking you were either my salvation or a hallucination. Either way, I was going to jump." "Good thing I caught you," Griffin chuckled, putting his arm around her. "You've been catching me ever since," she replied softly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the river flow past, each lost in memories of the decade they had shared. "You ever wonder," Penelope finally asked, "what would have happened if the flood hadn't come?" "If I hadn't been left behind," Griffin considered the question seriously. "I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow, maybe at a church social or in town, but it might have taken longer for me to work up the courage to speak to you." "The respectable schoolteacher and the solitary cowboy," Penelope mused. "It does seem unlikely on paper. But not impossible," Griffin added, "not when it's meant to be." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, they packed up their picnic and prepared to return home, where Abigail and James were being watched by Penelope's younger sister. Before mounting their horses, Griffin pulled Penelope into his arms, kissing her with the same tenderness he had shown on the day they wed. "Thank you," he said when they parted. "For what?" she asked, her hands resting on his chest. "For taking a chance on a man who didn't believe he deserved happiness. For our children. For making every day since that flood worth living." Penelope's eyes shimmered with emotion. "It was the flood that brought us together, but it's love that's kept us that way." "Love and choice every single day," Griffin nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. "And I choose you, Penelope Hayes, today and always." They rode home side by side as the setting sun gilded the landscape in amber light. Behind them, the river continued its eternal journey, a force of nature that had once threatened destruction, but had ultimately led to creation of a family, of a home, of a love strong enough to withstand whatever floods might come. At the crest of Redemption Ridge, they paused, looking down at the sprawling ranch that had grown from a simple cabin to a thriving enterprise. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the laughter of their children carried on the evening breeze as they played in the yard under their aunt's watchful eye. "Higher ground," Penelope murmured, echoing the words that had become something of a personal motto for them, both a reminder of where they had begun and how far they had come. Griffin reached across the space between their horses to take her hand, his green eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "Higher ground," he agreed, "together." And so they rode down the slope toward home, toward their children, Toward the future, they continued to build a future born from the moment a determined cowboy had ridden back alone through a raging flood to save a girl left behind, and in doing so, had saved himself as well.